October 5th, 1892. 5 armed men rode into Coffeyville, Kansas, planning to rob 2 banks simultaneously, something no gang had ever attempted. What they didn't know, the town had prepared for this exact scenario. Store owners had rifles, citizens had drilled. The robbery lasted 12 minutes. 4 of the 5 outlaws died on the street, and the age of the American outlaw ended that morning. Not with a law, with a lesson. This is the story of the Coffeyville Raid, not the Hollywood version with dramatic showdowns and noble gunfighters. This is the real story of how technology, communication, and community organization made the frontier outlaw obsolete, and how 5 men rode into a town that had already moved past them. The Dalton brothers weren't born criminals. They were born into a struggling frontier family in Kansas and Missouri. Their father, Lewis Dalton, had 15 children across 2 marriages. The family moved constantly, always looking for better prospects that never materialized. 3 of the brothers, Grattan, Bob, and Emmett, took legitimate work first. Grattan became a deputy U.S. Marshal. Bob worked as a lawman in Indian Territory. Emmett rode as a posseman. For a time, they were on the right side of the law, but frontier law enforcement was brutal and poorly paid. Deputy marshals earned fees for each arrest plus expenses, sometimes as little as $2 per arrest. They provided their own horses, weapons, and supplies. The work was dangerous. The pay was irregular. A deputy marshal might ride for days tracking a fugitive, risk his life in an arrest, and return home to find he'd earned less than a ranch hand made in a week. In 1890, Bob Dalton was accused of accepting bribes and allowing prisoners to escape. Whether the charges were true didn't matter. His reputation was destroyed. He couldn't work as a lawman anymore. So the brothers made a choice. If they couldn't earn money enforcing the law, they'd earn it breaking it. They studied the successes of previous outlaw gangs, particularly Jesse James and his brother Frank. The James Gang had operated for 16 years, robbing banks and trains across Missouri. They'd become legends. They'd made fortunes. Bob Dalton wanted to surpass that legacy. He told his brothers they would rob 2 banks at once, something even Jesse James had never done. It would be the most audacious robbery in American history. What Bob didn't understand was that the world had changed since Jesse James's time. In the 1870s, when the James Gang operated, communication moved at the speed of horses. A bank could be robbed in Missouri, and the gang could be in Kansas before anyone knew the crime had occurred. Towns were isolated. Law enforcement was fragmented. There was no coordination between jurisdictions. By 1892, everything was different. The telegraph had connected nearly every town in America. A robbery in one location could be reported to surrounding counties within minutes. Railroads allowed law enforcement to cover 200 miles in the time it used to take to travel 30. The speed advantage outlaws had enjoyed was gone. And most importantly, towns had learned. Coffeyville, Kansas had been raided by outlaws in 1876. Citizens remembered the fear, the helplessness. They'd vowed it wouldn't happen again. So they prepared. After the 1876 raid, Coffeyville's business owners held a meeting. They discussed what had gone wrong, the lack of weapons, the absence of coordination, the panic. They decided that if it happened again, they would be ready. Hardware stores began selling rifles to shopkeepers at cost. Banks installed reinforced doors and safes with time locks. Merchants kept loaded firearms behind their counters. When rumors circulated that outlaw gangs were operating nearby, townspeople didn't panic. They readied themselves. This wasn't paranoia. This was pragmatism. In frontier Kansas, you protected yourself because no one else would. The nearest federal marshal might be 100 miles away. So towns took responsibility for their own defense. Coffeyville wasn't unique. By the early 1890s, dozens of western towns had implemented similar measures. The era when a small gang could terrorize a community and escape unpunished was ending. The Dalton Gang didn't understand this. They'd successfully robbed trains in California and Indian Territory. They'd hit a bank in New Mexico. Each time, they'd escaped. The success bred confidence. In early October 1892, Bob announced the plan. They would ride into Coffeyville and rob both the Condon Bank and the First National Bank simultaneously. The two banks sat across the plaza from each other. If they hit both at once, they'd double their take and escape before anyone could respond. There was one problem. Coffeyville was the Dalton brothers' hometown. Bob, Grat, and Emmett had grown up there. Half the townspeople knew them by sight. Even with disguises, the risk of being identified was enormous. Emmett warned Bob. Grattan expressed doubts. Even the hired gang members, Bill Powers, Dick Broadwell, and Bill Doolin, questioned the wisdom of robbing a town where people would recognize them. Bob dismissed their concerns. He argued that familiarity was an advantage. They knew the streets, the layout, the escape routes. And besides, who would dare challenge 5 armed men? It was the thinking of someone who still believed in the old rules, where fear and intimidation were enough. Those rules no longer applied. On the morning of October 5th, the gang rode toward Coffeyville. Bill Doolin's horse went lame just outside town. He stayed behind. That decision saved his life. The remaining 5 men entered Coffeyville just after 9 in the morning. They wore fake beards and mustaches as disguises. Several townspeople recognized them immediately. The gang hitched their horses in an alley near the plaza, what locals called Death Alley. The plan was simple. Bob and Emmett would hit the First National Bank. Grat, Powers, and Broadwell would hit the Condon Bank. They'd grab the money and ride out within minutes. Bob and Emmett entered the First National Bank. 3 employees were inside: cashier Thomas Ayers, teller W.H. Shepard, and bookkeeper Bert Ayers. Bob drew his revolver and ordered them to fill sacks with money. The bank employees complied without argument. Within minutes, Bob and Emmett had taken approximately $20,000, nearly half the bank's reserves. For a moment, the plan seemed to be working perfectly. Across the plaza, Grat Dalton led Powers and Broadwell into the Condon Bank. 4 employees were working. Grat ordered them to open the vault and fill sacks with cash. Cashier Charles Ball looked at the vault and told Grat it was on a time lock. The mechanism wouldn't release for another 10 minutes. They would have to wait. This was a lie. The vault was already open. Ball was stalling. And outside, Coffeyville was mobilizing. Alec McKenna, a local merchant, had been standing on the street when the 5 men rode into town. He watched them enter both banks simultaneously. And despite the fake beards, he recognized them. McKenna ran toward Isham's hardware store, shouting as he went, "The Daltons are robbing the banks!" Henry Isham heard the warning and didn't hesitate. He unlocked his gun cabinet and began distributing rifles and ammunition to anyone who entered. George Cobain grabbed a Winchester rifle. Charles Brown took a rifle. Cyrus Lee armed himself. These weren't lawmen. They were shopkeepers, clerks, and tradesmen. But they'd prepared for this. Other citizens spread the alarm. Carey Seaman grabbed a rifle from his shop. John Kloehr, owner of a livery stable, armed himself and positioned himself across the street with a clear line of sight to the plaza. Henry Isham climbed to the 2nd floor of his hardware store with a rifle. From that elevated position, he had a commanding view of both banks. Store owners locked their doors and retrieved weapons. Women hurried children inside. Within minutes, armed men occupied positions around the plaza. They took cover behind water troughs, inside doorways, on 2nd-floor balconies. They weren't organized in any formal sense, but they understood what needed to happen. The Dalton Gang had walked into a trap of their own making. Inside the First National Bank, Bob heard shouting outside. He moved to the window and glanced out. Armed men were taking positions all around the plaza. Rifles were being aimed at the bank entrance. The town wasn't fleeing. The town was fighting. Bob grabbed the money sacks and shoved Emmett toward the door. They had to reach the horses before the shooting started. Across the plaza, Grat was still waiting for the time lock to open. Ball kept insisting it would just be another few minutes. Grat grew impatient and waved his revolver. But Ball didn't break. Every minute he delayed was another minute for the town to prepare. Powers and Broadwell moved to the windows and saw armed citizens gathering. "We need to leave," Powers said, "Now." But Grat refused. They'd come for the money. They weren't leaving without it. Outside, the first shots were fired. Bob and Emmett exited the First National Bank and ran toward Death Alley where their horses waited. The moment they emerged, citizens opened fire from windows and doorways. Bullets struck the wooden sidewalk. Bob returned fire as he ran. Emmett stayed close behind. City Marshal Charles Connolly stepped into the street with a revolver drawn. He was the town's lone lawman, an older man, not a gunfighter, but determined. He raised his weapon and shouted for the Daltons to stop. Bob didn't hesitate. He fired. Connolly fell, struck in the chest. He collapsed onto the street, mortally wounded. The Dalton brothers reached the alley. Their horses were still there. For a moment, it seemed they might escape. Then, Grat, Powers, and Broadwell emerged from the Condon Bank. They'd finally forced the vault open and grabbed what cash they could, about $1,500. But the delay had been fatal. By the time they exited, the plaza had transformed into a kill zone. John Kloehr fired from across the street. George Cubine stepped into the open with his Winchester. Grat Dalton saw him, turned, and fired. Cubine fell dead. Charles Brown, standing nearby, saw his friend fall. He ran to Cubine's body, grabbed the Winchester, and raised it. Grat shot him as well. Brown died instantly, but the return fire was relentless. Grat, Powers, and Broadwell ran for the alley, firing as they moved. They didn't make it. Bill Powers collapsed in the street, shot multiple times. He died within moments. Dick Broadwell reached his horse and managed to mount. He rode out at a full gallop, leaning low over the saddle. Citizens fired as he passed. One round struck him in the back. He kept riding. He made it half a mile outside town before the wound overwhelmed him. He fell from his saddle into a field and died there, alone. Grat Dalton staggered toward the alley, returning fire. A bullet struck him in the throat. Blood poured from the wound. He collapsed near a pile of stones and died where he fell. Bob and Emmett had mounted their horses. The path out of the alley was open. They could have escaped with the money. But Bob looked back and saw Grat fall. His brother was down, and Bob Dalton wasn't leaving without him. He dismounted and ran back toward Grat. That decision killed him. Citizens fired from every direction. Bob was struck multiple times, in the chest, the shoulder, the side. He stumbled, fell to one knee, and collapsed. He died in the alley, just yards from his horse. Emmett saw his brother go down. He should have ridden away, but he didn't. He turned his horse around, rode back into the gunfire, and reached down to grab Bob's body. It was an act of loyalty. It was also suicidal. Both barrels of a shotgun discharged into Emmett's back at close range. He collapsed across his brother's body. The shooting stopped. The Coffeyville raid had lasted 12 minutes. 4 gang members were dead: Bob Dalton, Grat Dalton, Bill Powers, and Dick Broadwell. Emmett Dalton survived, barely. He had been shot 23 times. Doctors didn't expect him to live through the night. 4 Coffeyville citizens were also dead: City Marshal Charles Connolly, George Cubine, Charles Brown, and Lucius Baldwin, a store clerk struck by a stray bullet. The bodies of the outlaws were dragged to the plaza and laid out for photographs. Within hours, crowds gathered. People came from surrounding towns to see the dead Dalton brothers with their own eyes. Photographers set up cameras and sold images as souvenirs. The bodies remained on display for a full day. It was macabre, but it was typical of the era. Public display of outlaw corpses served both as entertainment and as warning. Emmett Dalton defied every expectation and survived. His recovery took months. When he was finally well enough to stand trial, he was convicted and sentenced to life in prison at the Kansas State Penitentiary. He served 14 years before being pardoned in 1907. He moved to California, married his childhood sweetheart, and reinvented himself. He wrote a memoir titled When the Daltons Rode in 1931. He worked as a consultant on Western films. He lived a quiet, law-abiding life until 1937. He never committed another crime. Bill Doolin, the gang member whose horse went lame, escaped entirely. He formed his own gang and continued robbing for several more years. But in 1896, Doolin was tracked down by Deputy U.S. Marshal Heck Thomas and shot near Lawson, Oklahoma. The outlaw profession was dying, one man at a time. The Coffeyville raid destroyed the Dalton Gang in 12 minutes, but its impact went far beyond 5 dead outlaws. The raid became national news. The New York Times covered it. Papers in San Francisco, Chicago, and Boston ran accounts. Coffeyville became a symbol of organized citizen resistance. Other towns studied what had happened and implemented similar defenses. But the real lesson wasn't about bravery. It was about obsolescence. The outlaw gang as an economic model had depended on isolation, fear, and slow communication. By 1892, none of those conditions existed anymore. The telegraph meant every town knew when a gang was operating nearby. Railroads meant law enforcement could respond quickly, and repeated robberies had taught citizens to arm themselves and prepare. The Daltons weren't defeated by superior firepower. They were defeated by a world that had moved past them. Jesse James had been shot in 1882, 10 years before Coffeyville. The younger brothers were in prison. The frontier was closing. Towns were becoming cities. Law enforcement was professionalizing. The era that had created the outlaw was ending. Bob Dalton had wanted to surpass Jesse James. Instead, he became the proof that James's time was over. The outlaw hadn't been defeated by marshals or Pinkertons or federal troops. He'd been defeated by modernity, by infrastructure, by citizens who'd armed themselves and refused to be victims. Coffeyville didn't just kill the Dalton Gang. It killed the idea that a small group of armed men could terrorize a community and escape with impunity. That idea had worked for 20 years. On October 5, 1892, it stopped working. The bodies were buried, the plaza was cleaned, life in Coffeyville returned to normal. But something had shifted. The age of the frontier outlaw, the figure who dominated Western mythology for decades, had ended not with a dramatic showdown in some remote canyon, but on a town plaza in Kansas in broad daylight. Today, the Dalton Defenders Museum in Coffeyville preserves the history of the raid. Visitors can see photographs of the bodies. They can examine the rifles used by the citizens. They can walk Death Alley where the gang tied their horses. They can stand in the plaza where the shooting occurred. But the real story isn't about heroism or violence. It's about inevitability. 5 men rode into Coffeyville planning to commit the greatest robbery in American history. They rode into a world that had already moved past them. The telegraph had connected the towns. The railroads had brought law enforcement. The citizens had armed themselves. The Daltons thought they were making history. Instead, they became evidence that history had already moved on. The robbery lasted 12 minutes. The outlaw era ended that morning.